Scientists are researching improv and finding that there are some key qualities that we can all develop.
My name is Karen Chan Barrett, and I'm a postdoc in Charles's lab. And so I do a lot of things in the lab, but basically I'm on this research project on the neuroscience of creativity across art forms, and I also study music perception in cochlear implant users with Charles.
Amazing. Hello.
Same thing?
Yeah.
So my name is Charles Lim. I'm the Chief of Otology, Neurotology, and Skull-Based Surgery at the University of California, San Francisco in the Department of Otolaryngology, Head and Neck Surgery, and also Neurosurgery. And I run the Sound and Music Perception Lab, which studies how we hear sound, and in particular how we hear really complex sound like music. In addition to how we hear it, I'm very interested in how we actually produce or create musical ideas and musical patterns. And so that's led me to the study of creativity, which has been a fantastic journey.
Amazing. Okay, so the study of creativity, if we could go step by step from the idea, where you first got the idea, through building the study up to date. You know, if you can just walk us through it and zoom in as much as possible on pertinent details. You started it, why did you do it? What did you think was going to happen? How did you do it?
Sure.
Yeah, so this could, I mean, this might be a really long question, but that's okay.
Yeah.
This is important.
Just let me know whenever you want me to go.
I'm ready.
Okay. You know, I think when I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, there was several key decisions that I had to make. And one was that I would take care of people that were sick, in particular people that couldn't hear well. But I had always had music in my life. You know, I had spent my entire life as a musician. And so I felt that as a physician taking care of patients, I kept trying to get back to music. And so eventually I decided to actually study how the brain perceives music and sound by becoming a hearing specialist and by going to the National Institutes of Health to learn functional brain imaging. And while I was there, I think that my background as a jazz musician just kept kind of coming to the fore. And I kept thinking to myself, you know what, we can use these technologies to answer some pretty interesting questions that we know nothing about. And as somebody who had been, you know, I always viewed myself as like a struggling amateur jazz musician. And so as somebody who had sort of understood that something changes when you're improvising, I thought very naturally that it would make a good experiment for science. And so I started, this is many years ago, this is more than a decade ago, I started thinking about how we could convert these natural things that happen in jazz and music into science. And so I designed some early functional MRI experiments around playing the blues. And that was really centered around a simple idea, which is how does the brain produce a musical idea? If it's an idea that's never been generated before, how does it do that? And so that series of experiments led me, I think, to understand that we were maybe never going to have all the answers, but to understand that actually asking the questions itself is profound. And then also to understand that human creativity is so diverse, naturally, and that there's so many different forms of it that it made some sense, I think, to see what the linkages were between music and other forms of spontaneous creativity. And I think it doesn't take long to think about comedic improvisation. And you know, certainly somebody like Colin, who I remember watching when I was growing up, and think to myself, well, how does he do that? How does he do that? The same feeling I had when I listened to John Coltrane. I think, how does he do that? I was watching, you know, some of these comedic masters. I think, well, how are their brains so rapidly generating these ideas? And before you know it, we had a brain experiment.
Wow. And so how did you set up the parameters in order to ensure that you were studying what you actually were trying to study and not something else static?
Can I take that one?
Noise, you know?
Sure. Do you only want me to talk about the comedian one
No,
or
whatever,
everything?
anything.
Okay.
You can talk about both.
Okay, so I'm just going to give a quick overview about this general experiment we're doing. So we have a cooperative agreement with the National Endowment for the Arts, and as Charles mentioned, we are studying creativity and improvisation across art forms. And specifically, we're looking at world-class eminent musicians who are testing as case studies. We're also studying comedic improvisers. Colin is one of our case study comedian improvisers, but we also have some group experiment with them. And then we're also looking at visual artists, many of them recruited from San Francisco Art Institute in the Bay Area art scene. And basically, when we wanted to look at what are the neural correlates of improvisation across these different art forms, where are they similar, where are they different? And in addition to all of that, we also want to know about some cognitive aspects of it. So, Charles was saying, we always wonder, how do they do that? Well, is it because of aspects of their personality? Or is it they're really good at creative thinking? Or they're very good at reasoning or language? So we're doing a bunch of pencil and paper psychological assessments too. So there's this component of the psychological, pencil and paper, behavioral assessments, as well as the neural imaging thing. And so it's been really great. The funny thing that we noticed is that most of what we know about the neuroscience of creativity generally comes from the field of music. We know relatively little about the other fields like comedic improvisation and visual arts. And there's so many ways to be creative in many different art forms: cooking, dance, sports, science, But we started with comedy, visual arts, and music because we thought they would be really adaptable for this fMRI scanner. We have limits that we can operate within a scanner, right? You basically have a big magnetic bore. They have to be able to lie still, but be able to do something that we can measure, which means dance is kind of right now for us. You can't really dance in the scanner. But the 3 art forms we chose are very amenable to being put into the fMRI scanner. And not only that, what we really spend a long time thinking is, okay, if you want to look at what are the neural substrates of improvisation, great, your experimental condition can be to look at improvisation. But then you have to have a matching control condition. And for us, that control condition in general is doing some sort of rote activity or something that you're maybe pre-memorized. So you're still doing an artistic activity, right? You still have to do something, but it's more rote and planned versus improvising. So that's the general premise about all of our experiments. We always have a control condition that's pre-planned, pre-memorized, pre-generated versus improvising on the spot.
And how many people have you studied?
Well, so far, on the eminent musicians as case studies, I think we're up to 7. For our comedians, I think we have 12. And visual artists, we're just starting right now. We're about to start pilot experimenting, which means trying out the paradigm on a single subject to see if everything is working. And we're hoping to get 12 to 15 subjects for that.
That's just for the recent.
Yeah, that's for the recent
yeah,
creativity.
Prior to that, because we've been doing, I've been involved in a lot of these studies starting back in 2003. And so It's been a lot of musicians over the years.
Yeah.
And so is anything published in terms of those previous studies, and what were the conclusions and things that surprised you or things that...
Sure. So, our original study was a simple study of piano players playing the blues in the brain scanner. And, I say simple just because the idea was simple. Actually, to pull it off was very difficult for me. It took 2 years, for example, just to get the piano to work in the scanner. But in the end, what we were able to do was to show that when a musician switches from a memorized rote form of thinking into a creative, improvising, free-flowing thinking, their brain activity changes. It's as simple as that. The brain activity is quite fundamentally different between something memorized and something that's generated spontaneously. And if you had to pick one area of the brain to kind of isolate that seems to really be transforming itself in at least a professional musician, it's the prefrontal cortex of the brain. That's this front large part of the brain that really defines what makes us human. As opposed to sensory processing systems, which our brains are dedicated to basically taking in information and putting out movements, and then having some sort of cognitive superstructure on top of that. The area that has the cognitive superstructure is really shutting itself down or off almost during these improvisational flow states. And so you can almost view it like the brain is trying to get out of its own way to allow the brain to do things without conscious self-monitoring, without effortful planning, in a way without impeding its own generation of novelty.
And so, for the average person, how much worse are they at doing that than these experts?
Yeah, that's a funny question. So one thing we have found is that because we really want to understand what the differences are, we're looking at some of the world's best creative musicians, artists, comedians, and whatnot. But we understand that these behaviors are actually rooted in everyday life. And so everybody is creative. It's just a question to what extent and in what context. When we have a conversation, it's not scripted. It's something that we're creating and generating on the spot. You'll take a group of children that have never had any art training and you give them a pencil and a paper, and before you know it, every kid's got something wildly creative on their sheet of paper. And I think that's just human nature. We're hardwired to create. So I think that is, to me, it's a big lesson that eventually we have to connect between what we're seeing in a high-level artist and what we're seeing in everyday life to understand the many diverse forms of creativity, both big and small, both high and low, because I think in the end, they're all part of the fundamental human experience.
And this whole field in general hasn't been around that long. I remember Charles's paper in 2008 was one of the first papers to even, and there were other researchers, of course, who had some around that time too, but basically they were the forefront of studying the neuroscience of creativity. So it's only 2019 now, so it hasn't actually been that long. So I feel like we have a lot to learn. Most of the scientific studies on creativity do tend to right now focus on experts, maybe not like the paragons of our art society, but they are definitely professionals. And we actually don't know as much about amateur improvisers or children improvising or the beginner improviser. So I feel like there's still so much work to be done. And even this project, looking at improvisation across the art form, is just the first. It's very much just at the cusp of what we know. So there's a ton of more research to do.
I've come to believe that over time of studying a lot of high-level artists and then talking to how they became who they are, that there's a process. It's not that they're just born with superb talent and boom, before you know it, Colin Mochrie is just Colin Mochrie. I think there's a lot of effort and practice that goes into this. And so to some extent, I think everybody has a certain amount of creative aptitude, and then it has to be developed. And I think that the circumstances and the energy that one puts towards developing those things will determine in the end how facile they are with that attribute that they have. I don't know that it's that much different than a lot of other skills. It just happens to be in the creative domain. And so, it's funny because, for example, a jazz improvisation thing, if you've never played music, it's hard to do a jazz improvisation task. So we don't really know what it's like in a child doing that. So we're trying to come up with ways to have someone who's untrained do these tasks in a very basic form. And it's been fascinating because I think what we're going to see is that there's a lot of similarities between the amateur creative brain and the professional creative brain, but where they're really different, I think, is in the ease and the automaticity with which somebody can cut off some of their conscious self-monitoring mechanisms. In fact, probably what separates the amateur from the expert is that the amateur can't do that. I mean, their brain is always getting in their way. As soon as they start to play something, they think, oh, that sounds so stupid. Oh, I'm making a mistake. Oh, I don't know how to do this. How do I hit that note? I don't understand what this chord is. I don't know what the scale is. And before you know it, they're not in a state of flow. They're actually in the opposite. They're clamping their brain down. And if you've ever tried to do a creative task that you're not good at in public, you know right away what that feeling is because you feel this immediate self-consciousness hit you. And it's the opposite of what I think a professional improviser has, which is actually a very big lack of self-consciousness when they're doing what they're doing.
And so it's really interesting too. So Charles is a jazz musician and a great improviser, and so naturally, this whole studying the neuroscience of improvisation and creativity is something that comes very, it makes sense given his background. So for me, I have my PhD in music cognition, but I am a classical musician. So classical music training is completely different from jazz. We don't improvise, right? Everything is about expressivity in your music, but also just mastering a composition that you're trying to perform and doing it over and over again for perfection's sake, right? So then when I sit down and improvise, I'm like a complete beginner, even though I'm not a beginner pianist per se, right? So there are a lot of other shades of expertise that we can look, and how I got involved with Charles, and even though I'm not an improviser or creative in that sense, I was really interested in Charles's work, and the reason I wanted to do a postdoc with him was because I'm really interested in this idea of expertise, right? Like how does the brain change with training or with exposure to music and things like that? And it comes down, I agree with Charles, that everyone has maybe talent and capabilities to do things, but to really maximize everything is definitely practice and making sure you have the know-how, the knowledge, that having it in your fingers, so to speak, or knowing the lingo of music to be able to produce it, So that's kind of how our research interests were kind of tangential and came together to study the creativity.
I want to zoom into the concept of conscious self-monitoring. Really, sort of, where is the monitoring coming from in the brain, and then how is it being redirected or turned off, I guess, if you will.
So let me try to frame it this way. we function in various states of consciousness all day long. Okay, and so here's a good example. When you're driving to work, you're weaving through traffic, you're going through the highway, and yet you're on a phone call. Okay, so you can do both of those tasks at the same time. And so what's actually happening there? Most of your direct consciousness is actually directed towards the phone call. You're having a very sophisticated conversation about ideas being exchanged, you're thinking about what you're saying and so forth. And in the meantime, in the background, you're driving, you're braking, you're accelerating, you're changing lanes. You're not actually thinking too much about that if you've been a comfortable driver. But if you think about the neurological requirements to drive a car without crashing, it's actually very sophisticated, right? And so somehow in this development of somebody who is a seasoned driver, they can put that task into their subconscious, not quite subconscious, but less in the foreground and more in the background, and get it done safely. And that's just a very simple matter for most people. You don't have to think about it. Let's take even something more basic, walking, okay? Mm-hmm. We know that walking is a very complex neurologic activity, and we know that because when people have neurologic deficits, they can't walk well. It's a very hard thing to accomplish. I personally experienced this self-consciousness of walking when I was being filmed for a news piece, and they said, okay, now we just want you to walk from this clinic to that clinic. And all of a sudden, before you know it, I'm like this, right? And they're like, no, just walk naturally. And I'm like, I am trying. And so like, I thought to myself, I don't know how to walk naturally. And so because I was thinking about how to walk, suddenly I couldn't walk. And so that's an example of where if you try to directly control output that is normally automated, you actually make it worse. And so take a free throw shooter who can shoot 90%, 95%, and then you tell them, okay, you make the next one, I give you $10 million. Then all of a sudden, overthinking everything, they get in the way of their flow, and they're more likely to miss than had they not been told that. That's an example of your consciousness interfering with your output. So the relationship between consciousness, behavioral output is very, I think, multi-layered and important, especially when we think about things like flow states and how the brain can generate ideas with or without suppression. That's, to me, where conscious self-monitoring comes in.
Do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to add on that, it's very exactly true. And I think from a scientific perspective, right, again, this is still very new and we're still, trying to corroborate everything. But in general, something that becomes quite involved during improvisation is something known as the default mode network, which is that network in the brain that's involved when you're kind of mind wandering or daydreaming or resting, and they think there's that element of that, you're not really monitoring everything. But at the same time, there is a little bit of consciousness because let's say I need to generate an idea. You have what's known as the executive network, which has to help you get some ideas and try to evaluate, is that a good idea? Does that fit with this? So it's probably like a balance. I mean, scientifically, there's probably these networks that are always in tandem with each other, helping you to do some of this, the different states of consciousness.
Okay. Man, the question came to mind and then I lost it.
You overthought it.
Yeah,
when it comes back, you can do it again.
I do see that idea of yes, now I remember. The word confidence popped in my mind. Having confidence. Does that have anything to do with it? Is that a neurological process, confidence, do you think?
I think in some ways everything is neurological, right? I mean, so everything comes from our brains. And so confidence, which is, I think, it's in a way a psychological construct that's based on being prepared for something and feeling that you are adequate for the task, I think is very important in terms of release of self-consciousness. So if you are not confident, I think that feeling is very hard to shake when you're trying to do something at a high level and let go. And so maybe I think some of the biggest breakthroughs that artists have are when they finally can release that feeling and let go of feelings of insecurity or inadequacy. I think that's actually critical to getting to a certain level, and that's where I think practice comes in.
Yeah, I would say I think confidence is also related to expertise, right? So when you do something, let's say you're a really practiced classical musician and you know your skills inside out. It's like us, walking. It's so procedural. You can just whip them out whenever. It's in your fingers. You don't even have to think about it. And then, by getting confidence in a new domain of music, let's say you're learning jazz when you've done something else, yeah, you don't have that confidence, maybe because you don't have that expertise too behind it, right? It has to be much more deliberate. Like if you've ever watched someone play piano, a beginner piano student, it's like, oh, I have to remember to move this finger and then this one. Oh, but then I forgot about this hand, and everything is very, deliberate and measured, and they have to keep working at it, and that's not confidence, because eventually, when they're, a more confident player, everything just comes out more fluidly, and they can just kind of make it all happen without having to be so deliberate about every single aspect of their playing.
Oh yeah. Okay. So the purpose of this movie is we want to save the world. Okay.
It's a good goal.
Yeah,
Right?
Really good goal.
Yeah.
So how can this work? How can your research, that what we're talking about here, how might that help us in that end?
Yes. It's funny. I always ask myself, why do I do the research that I do? And what's the point of it all? Like, why ask these questions? Why try to find out? Maybe it's a similar question to why make a movie about this idea. And what I've decided on is that there's a couple of important principles. One is the pursuit of truth. And I think that science and art, if I can boil it down to what they are trying to do, I feel like they're both trying to approach the truth of what it means to be alive, and what it means to be a human or to be something in this universe. And that, I think, has intrinsic significance. Now, on a more practical level, I think creativity is something that we tend to view in the realm of entertainment today, but I think that's actually a mistake. I think that it's much deeper than that, much more important than that, and if you extrapolate back in time, has actually been responsible for how human beings have survived. And so another way to put it, I think if human beings never had the capacity for creativity, you could quite easily argue that they would never have survived, that they just would not have been able to adapt to changing circumstances and to figure out all these intricacies of patterns and to figure out how to innovate on top of those patterns. And so I think the way I view this research is that it's trying to save the world by understanding how it is that humans survived and how we're going to survive. I think moving forward, we don't understand very well how it is that human beings are creative, but that's probably the one attribute that's going to save our society in the future, make us better, make us innovate, make us novel, and make us problem solve in a way that we've never been able to. So I think it's important.
About creativity is like a necessary thing for survival. What would you like to add?
Well, I just completely agree with what Charles says. I mean, right now the arts are often, undervalued by society, politicians, but the thing is that we notice is that pretty much every society on this planet has had music. We have archaeological evidence that every society creates. They write, they perform music, they do visual art. And so I feel like it is very deeply ingrained in us to want to produce art and be creative, and it's a form of communication. And like Charles, I firmly believe that without creativity, we would have nothing. We would have no innovation, no technological advances. A society without artistic creativity would be a poor society, in that it would only be on basic survival. It wouldn't have all the extra elements that make a society and a culture function. And so, like Charles, I feel like the creativity is one of these fundamental aspects that we need for our society to keep evolving. And, I think we just need to keep trying to better understand how that might work. Maybe we never understand it completely, and maybe our research, maybe in 50, 100 years, people are going to look at the papers Charles and I have written and be like, what, they thought this was happening? It's completely different. But that's science, and that's also part of the scientific creativity, to keep looking and questing for new things. So, I think this is a worthy project.
I do too.
One hopes. So we'll keep telling ourselves that anyway.
I know. We keep telling Grant County Juries, this is why we need to keep doing this work.
We need to save the world.
So back to the research, and is there any difference among the types that you've already identified among a comedian versus a musician in terms of what's going on in here?
Yeah, so let's just to be perfectly clear, we've done most of our work in musicians, and we're just starting to look at comedians. And so the tasks are not exactly analogous to one another, right? So the task that's faced by an improvising comedian is a little bit different than faced by a jazz musician. And in a way, the metrics of success are a little bit different too. And so there's also obviously a language component to comedic improvisation that's not as directly present in, say, jazz, or a different version of language components. And so what we're seeing, I would say, from a preliminary perspective, is that certainly in both jazz musicians and also improvising comedians, when one switches from something that's memorized to improvised, the brain is switching modes. Okay, that we're seeing for sure. But it also seems to be very context dependent in terms of the specific comedic environment that we're putting somebody through. So for example, you can think of, and just like watching, Colin and Whose Line Is It Anyway, like during a show, they'll go through, 4 or 5 different games, tasks where the scene is different. The requirements that are of the brain neurologically to participate in that comedic environment changes. And we're seeing that in the brain scans, that when we switch the environment, we're seeing changes. Some areas of the brain are more active than others. Some areas of the brain are less active than others. There's more prefrontal suppression in some flow state things and maybe a little bit less in some others that are a little bit more like storytelling. And so we have to figure out, I think, what the nuances really are. I've seen enough to know that it's going to be profound and important for us to understand these things. Also enough to understand that looking at different art forms is really relevant, because I think the mistake is to think that these are simple processes. They're not. The questions are not simple, the answers are not simple, and the more we flesh out the full range of these things, I think in a way it's how we pay tribute to the full diverse of creativity, because we understand that it's not just one thing happening in the brain. It's a billion things happening in the brain that change in very subtle ways depending on what the actual creative task is at that moment and who that person is.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with Charles. I think what's really interesting about doing case studies, like working with Colin, Mochrie, or these great musicians, instead of just averaging all their brains together in one group experiment, is we also get a look at how individuals might manifest creativity differently. So I think in the future, we really need to kind of balance looking at how different brains and different approaches to creativity might be different, but then also try to see, but what are some general things that are happening when we're being creative? So yeah, it's very preliminary right now, but pretty interesting.
So what are you expecting this, when you complete your project? What are you expecting? What are you trying to prove or disprove?
Our hypotheses, basically?
Yeah.
Do you want to do it?
I think the way I put it is that there's short-term goals and then there's long-term goals. To me, the long-term goal is to contribute to the development of a neural model for how creativity emerges in the brain. That, to me, is the big goal. And I think that maybe every creativity research that's in neuroscience probably shares that goal, that in the end we'll aggregate all of our findings and a viable model of human creativity will emerge. On the short term, I think it's to figure out how to design the right experiment. So it's a hard thing to do, actually, to take someone out of their natural environment. We're not in a comedy club or on a stage. We're in a brain scanner, and to make sure that that experiment doesn't strip the artist of the kind of what they need to actually feel like they're doing what they do is actually it's a challenging thing. And so not only do we have to figure out how to adapt the comedic challenges to the brain scanner, but we also have to figure out how to make them feel like it's relatively similar to what they do. In the same way that a jazz musician playing in a brain scanner, it's not like playing at the Village Vanguard. It's a different environment. And so the fortunate thing is that both jazz musicians, freestyle rappers, comedic improvisers, they're the most adaptable people in the world. I mean, actually, I think a lot of their training is to just yes and to whatever is happening, whether it's a brain scan, whether it's neuroscientists studying them while they're doing these things, and to incorporate that into their understanding of what's taking place. It's pretty brilliant, I think.
And definitely, at least for this National Endowment for the Arts project, the current project that we're doing, it's obviously very exploratory. As I said, we don't have a lot of knowledge about, improvisation, creativity across art forms. I mean, our specific hypotheses, and as I said, it's exploratory, so we really were just kind of seeing what happened, but I guess we wanted to see, are there certain commonalities in terms of the neural substrates that are involved in creativity across art forms, and then yet where are the differences? As we said, because comedy is very different from music, what are those differences going to look like in the brain? One is language, one is not language, and things like this. And if you do visual artists, obviously the visual cortex is probably involved in a different way than when with the other two art forms. So really we're just trying to see what happens. We do suspect that there are certain commonalities to creativity, but that there are going to be differences, of course, too, across the different art domains.
And when you talk about a model of what then will these future scientists be able to do with that model? What will be the step after you're done?
So oftentimes the way cognitive scientists work is to take a behavior and then to start to understand the mechanism behind it. And so when I say a model, what I'm really talking about is something that's comprehensive, one that identifies the brain structures that are involved in creativity, but also the flow of information between those structures, and then eventually the synaptic strengths of different circuits within certain environments, which neurotransmitters are involved, when they're involved. The purpose of all that is to then be able to figure out how to facilitate those networks. And so if in the end we're able to describe how creativity emerges in the brain, we should then be able to figure out how to enhance how creativity emerges in the brain. And I've always said this, if we could make human beings globally 2% more creative, I mean, think about what would happen to our planet if we could achieve something like that through facilitating neural networks.
Wow, that's actually got my mind going there. Wow. So a couple of the things that come to mind, the reason why people aren't as creative as they should be or could be are things like shame and fear. What have you discovered about those two things in the course of your research?
Do you want to talk about that?
You go first.
Well, I think that there are a lot of personal backgrounds and attributes that all factor into how somebody is or is not able to be creative. And I think this factors into somewhat about confidence and comfort level, but also I think feeling worthy. And this is where I think that a lot of art is about the truth, right? It's about trying to seek your own personal truth. And a lot of that is struggling with your own demons. And that's why the relationship between pathology and the brain and the arts has been forever linked. I mean, there's always been a deep connection between brain pathology, psychological trauma, happiness, sadness, and the arts. I mean, those are maybe the most fundamental themes, if you include love in that mix. Now, we ourselves are not looking at fear or shame as specific goals of our study, but what we are trying to do is to understand personalities and people and to figure out how those things will affect somebody's art form. And so I think in doing the psychological assessments, certain traits should emerge. We're not psychiatrists, we're not psychologists, and so one thing I want to avoid is, in a way, I want to avoid a punchline, right? So I want to, unlike a comedian, I don't want the research to be boiled down to a soundbite, where we say that you need to overcome fear in order to be more like that to me is too simple. On the other hand, to understand that something like fear leads to self-consciousness that might inhibit creativity, that's, I think, a very important relationship to figure out, to identify, and to characterize. And so hopefully in the end, this kind of work will help us do those things.
Yeah, I agree with Charles. I mean, our research, we're not psychologists, so we're not specifically studying the impact of shame or fear on creativity. But I mean, anecdotally, I think this is very true among a lot of artists, is that, where does stage fright come from, right? We talk about this all the time. Where do the nerves, when you walk out on stage, your heart is racing, where all these nerves come from? And I think stage fright comes from a fear of being vulnerable in front of someone, about letting down your guard and letting people in. And I think improvisation especially, right? You didn't have anything prepared and all of a sudden you have to spew things out. What if people don't like it? What if they have a bad response to it, right? So I think in general, all of us, part of being a performing artist is learning how to feel some of that fear, that shame, that anxiety, the stage fright, whatever it is, learn how to cope with it and somehow channel that into still being creative and expressive. And, so, I mean, that's more not me speaking as a scientist, but more me speaking as, someone who is a performer, and my music cognition students always ask me that, like, well, how do we combat stage fright? We'd love to understand how the brain works, and this is wonderful, but then how do we use that? And I'm like, well, I mean, we know, all this will eventually come together. But yes, anecdotally, of course, all of us are. I think a lot of the fear of public speaking, of improvisation, comes from an anxiety about failing in front of people, or showing vulnerability, or things like that.
And there's, I think, another aspect of this, which is that the use of art or music as therapy is something that has long existed but not been well understood. And so I think that scientists need to really start understanding the concrete benefits of something like art therapy, music therapy, not just observationally, but to actually understand in the brain what changed. And I think that I've spoken to enough artists and musicians to know that they firmly have observed that they believe they're affecting the audience in a positive way, right? That somebody's life, when an audience member listens to a performance and they're changed. There's some sort of healing that took place in that person during that hour or 2 hours of their lives. And we need to figure out how to, I think, harness the power of art to do that. And this is maybe, fear and shame, not from how it affects how you improvise, but how it can help you overcome fear or shame and, come to terms with whatever it is that's happened in your life through the use of the arts. To me, because the arts are maybe the best way for how humans communicate from one to another and pass on eternal experiences that everyone understands, that to me is maybe one of the most profound things about why something like art therapy works.
That's where I was last night with the Living Arts Playback Theater there in Oakland. And basically what they do is, it's very simple. They have an audience, and then the people tell stories, and then they improvise back the stories that they've just heard. And they were at a men's prison, and this guy told the story about when he was a teenager, they were walking across a bridge, and someone took one of the girls that he was walking with and threw her off the bridge.
Oh my God.
And he's lived with the guilt that I should have saved her his entire life, never told anyone the story. And when they came and did it, he told the story, and they did it. And this is the first time this guy's ever felt any release of that guilt. And I mean, and that's just one of hundreds of stories, And it'd be nice if you could, but anecdotally, I mean, obviously there's lots of people healing. I mean, even you go see a movie, I feel like,
Well, it's pretty interesting that the arts have persisted even though there's no obvious survival advantage, right? And it's like every human culture historically has always had the arts, but why? And there must be some version of catharsis must not just be an experiential thing. There must be something neurological about it.
There's been some research done on play itself, and that's pretty much still a mystery. I mean, what can you tell us about play, based on what you know?
Personally, I tend to shy away from trying to say too much about that, but I will say that I think it's crucially important. I mean, in a way, you could view it as, I think it's another aspect of human creativity, right? And you see it in children, but I think it gets lost oftentimes in adulthood. And I think a lot of some of the work that people are doing in the field of that is to understand how to take the elements of play that are so important when you're younger and to infuse it into life when you're older, so that you actually don't lose the interactive social benefits. And I think humor has the same kind of thing. I think there's such healing powers to laughter and to smiling. These things I think are genuinely transformative, especially if you're someone who doesn't have an easy time getting to those stages in life. And so this is where I think comedy often, it's very powerful. This is not just about having fun. It's about actually, I think, maybe allowing somebody to have joy when they've not had it.
Don't really have much to add to that. That was great.
Yeah, that was great. Okay, I'm just going to go back. Oh, I know what I want to ask you about. So, you did the study on Colin Mochrie.
Right.
How did he do? What were
Colin's the best.
He's not fantastic. We were laughing hysterically while we were.
First of all, he's just so, I think, genuine in the way he approaches his art, that the way he approached us as scientists was almost like it was another version of of improvising. And he immediately understood what we were trying to do. It didn't take a lot of time for him to get it. And in the scanner, you could tell he was just really trying his best to just be comfortable in there and do what he does. And for us, it was such an honor and a privilege
amazing.
to spend the morning with him, you know, listening to his brain in these wacky situations that we had devised on our own in the lab, and then hearing him reflected back to us through the brain scanner. And so it's a real privilege. He was fantastic. In fact, anytime, Colin, if you're watching this, if anytime you want to come back and join us for another brain scan, we would do it 1,000 times over. I mean, there's so much information. We could just keep extracting information from his brain over and over again and continually get useful material for us.
Yeah, Colin, you were amazing. No, he was total consummate professional. I mean, you know, I think a lot of people who come to these MRI studies, I mean, for some people, maybe the last time they were ever in an fMRI machine was in a medical context. It's kind of nerve-wracking. Or they've never seen this big noisy machine and suddenly people are sticking them in there and they're supposed to, you know, somehow perform. But he was the consummate professional. He did it really well. He was, you know, it was very collaborative. Like we talked in advance before we put in the scanner about ideas of paradigms. Like he helped us develop and get ideas on what to test with him. And, you know, for him, he said the hardest part was lying still the whole time, right? He has to keep his head completely still. And for him, comedy is kind of a you know, kinesthetic too. You use your body, right? So that was very hard, is we had to have him lie really still and just keep his head like only use his mouth. The other thing that he said that was hard is that normally when he's performing, he's like, I can't tell if people liked it. You know, I don't see you guys laughing. I'm like, oh, we were laughing. You just didn't, you know, you're just focused on what you're doing in the scanner. But he said that part, he's like, oh, and I'm alone talking to myself and I don't have a partner. You know, it's not like what they do on Whose Line Is It Anyways? But he was great. He adapted really well to it. He was so professional and just wonderful. Like, yes, I would love to test him over and over again.
And somehow his humility came through. You know, just I think that's even in his comedy, he brings that in. There's a certain slight self-deprecating, you know, very humble edge to like. There's no arrogance comes across when he's delivering his comedy. I think that's very hard when the spotlight's on you and you're being funny and you're being witty and insightful to somehow have no arrogance to it. And he manages that in a fantastic way that I really admire about him. And he was that way at the brain scan. I think he was very humble, and in a way he felt, I think, privileged to have the experience of having his brain scan, and he was just, I think, very appreciative of our interest in him. And so it was really a terrific experience for everybody. It was we feel very lucky that we were able to spend that time with him.
And now his brain, what have you learned about his brain?
So we are just in the process of trying to understand it, and we are seeing a couple of patterns emerge. And one of the, I think, major take-home points is that he does have the same thing that we saw in professional jazz musicians, which is that when he starts to improvise as compared to when he's doing a memorized task, he is suppressing his prefrontal cortex. But the amount of prefrontal cortical suppression changes quite drastically depending on the task he's doing. So we had him do about 6 or 7 different environments, and we could see that there are some areas that it's much more pronounced in, and then in others. The other thing that's important is which area of the prefrontal cortex is being deactivated, because it's not always the same spot. And so we saw sometimes it was a little bit more medial and more towards the default area, and others it was more lateral and flanking areas of the prefrontal cortex. And then the degree of activation. And so, you know, it's not always a story of just how the brain turns itself off. And we saw in Colin's brain when he was improvising in this, so we had him do an extended storytelling thing where the story kept changing, he just kept adding to it, that there was a lot of activation happening as he was telling this story in his brain relative to a memorized story. And so it was kind of, I think, intriguing for us to understand that these are very nuanced things, and in the end, our models of creativity won't be, hopefully, superficial. Hopefully they'll be robust, and they'll reflect the richness of what actually happens in actual comedic mastermind, such as Colin.
And where were the activations happening when he was doing the story?
Very diffuse in his brain. So for example, throughout his temporal cortices, throughout his occipital cortices, we saw robust activation happening, which is interesting because it almost suggests that he's utilizing or recruiting other parts of his brain to generate some of this novel material. You know, the output is verbal, but what's happening in his brain is not just verbal areas of the brain. And so we have to understand that when he is being creative, it's a whole brain activity. some areas of the brain are ramping up, some areas of the brain are turning off. And it's this sort of coordinated orchestration between these things happening that allows him to have that output. But this is all, we have to do a lot more analysis before we're comfortable. And whenever it's a single subject study, you do a deep dive into everything you can see, so you can start to characterize that person. But we have no real reference point. There's no sort of Colin Mochrie,
control
neutral
group
version of Colin to compare him to. So we have to, in a way, take everything just as it is. And so what we're doing right now is we're trying to describe all of the findings objectively. And then we'll figure out how to interpret what we're seeing.
Agreed. And I'm still working through scoring a lot of his psychological assessments. We'll have to see what happens. Already I could tell he did excellently on fluid reasoning abilities, which is fluid intelligence, the ability to reason on the spot. We thought that would correlate with improvisation. Like, someone who's really good at improvising probably is really good at, having working memory and figuring things out and reasoning abstractions and stuff right on the spot. And that is something Colin does really well, at least on the standardized test. But like I said, it's still preliminary. I have to grade the rest of all his assessments. But yeah, I mean, it's really, I think one of the great joys with working with Colin, and something Charles and I really love, we had several phone calls where we're like, so you get Colin Mochrie in the scanner. What do we do? I'm like, I don't know. The world's our oyster. We could do anything, because it's Colin. I'm sure he can handle anything. And so, what was really fun is just like coming up with these like very specific paradigms for him. Like what I did, and Charles did too, is we sat there and watched a lot of his old Whose Line Is It Anyways performances. And we looked at the various games they were playing, narrate, scenes from a hat, The World's Worst. And, we kept looking at it and looking at how Colin was working, and then, came up with, we kind of tried to adapt those Whose Line Is It Anyways games for our experimental paradigms. And then knowing that like, well, this is really hard. I wouldn't just throw this at anybody, but we could throw it at Colin. I think he can do this, And that was such a joy to really be, what part of the advantage, I guess, of case studies is maybe it doesn't have the statistical rigor that you would have with tons and tons of subjects, but you really get to like tailor your experimental paradigm to the person. So that was really fun.
So could you just tell us a few of the games that you played with him?
Yeah. So we ran 2 games on him that we had done with our other group experiment, which is one monologue, where you just have to monologue on a prompt that we give you, like birds of prey or something, and then you have to suddenly do a 60-second monologue on birds of prey. Another game we did was 3 things, where we to give you a category of something like building materials or something like that, and you have to come up with 3 things that are building materials. So these are kind of good, smaller improv warm-up games. But then the things that we tailored to Colin specifically, we had one that's kind of based off the game Narrate from Whose Line Is It Anyways, but because Colin didn't have a partner, what we did is he has to narrate what's going on in his mind. So what I did for this improvisation game is I said, okay, I'll give you a prompt, and then you have to start talking for 30 seconds, and then I'm gonna give you another prompt, and you have to just run with that, like as if I'm his partner, but it's all pre-recorded. So that was one game that we created with him. We did this cool music improvisation game. We called it improvising, like changing lyrics to nursery rhymes. So first he had to sing, Mary Had a Little Lamb, but then he had to then sing Mary Had a Little Lamb, but improvising lyrics on top of the background music we gave him. So that was really fun. And then finally, the last game we did with him is kind of similar to 90-Second Alphabet from Whose Line Is It Anyways, but I called it the ABC game. And I said, okay, here's your scenario. Teach your grandma how to use an iPhone, and you're going to tell me that starting on J. And he has to make up a whole story using each new letter of the alphabet for each new sentence. So it was really fun, at least certainly fun and creative for me to get to really immerse myself in watching Colin perform, and then try to figure out a way to actually test him in the scanner. So I was pretty happy with that, considering that, Whose Line Is It Anyways is much more about the play between the actors. We found a way to do it solo and just for Colin in the scanner. So.
Yeah, he had fun.
Good. I think he was kind of like, oh my God, what are they doing? Putting me in this giant scanner, but he did great.
And it was nice for us to do some tasks that were a little bit musical also, because he does have that ability. And so, as we had him make up these new lyrics, he was also singing them, and there was a rhythmic aspect to it. So that's kind of nice to see how that kind of comedy relates to things where it's purely speech. So for example, in the one where the story kept evolving, like we start out saying something like, you look at your watch and you realize you're half an hour late to the airport. and go. And then he just had to start building a whole story around that idea. And then we would change the prompt. You get to the airport and you see your ex-girlfriend, and so forth. And it just kept getting wilder and wilder. And he was just so funny. I mean, we were cracking up.
Yeah, and we were throwing random stuff at him. I'm like, the more random, let's see what he does with it. And he just ran with it, and it was amazing, and we were laughing hysterically while we were sitting. So Colin's in the scanner, and we're in the control room watching him, and we're just laughing hysterically.
Yeah, too bad he couldn't hear your laugh.
I know, he's like, I wish I could have heard that you guys liked what I was doing. I was like, we loved it.
Oh, that's great. I'm just going to refer back to the list here. We've got a lot of good stuff already.
Good.
So,
Good, cool. Good. 11:30. Simon?
No, Anthony from UCLA.
How's he doing?
Good.
One thing that we talked a little bit about stage fright. I wanted to see if maybe writer's block is something that people have come to you about, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, so I don't know that people have come to us, but I do think there's a strong relationship between writer's block and a lot of the things we're looking at. And so the interesting thing to me about writer's block is that the person's not any different. It's the same person having that. So everyone has experienced the situation where one day you can, everything's flowing and you can write 5 pages in 30 minutes. The other situation where nothing is flowing and you stare at a blank page and you write 5 sentences over a month, right? And you hate them. And so, but you're still the same person, or are you? And so I think the question is, what is actually changing in those situations? And it's the functional state of the brain. It's how lubricated the circuitry of creativity is. And so I often think that one of the potential benefits of this kind of research is to, again, we understand how that circuitry emerges and to figure out how to facilitate it. I mean, maybe in the end we could solve writer's block by figuring out some sort of way to overcome the circuits that are inhibiting creative processes. It's not that different than, everybody has a cup of coffee in the morning to start their day and to basically get their wheels turning. Some people feel like they can't actually work until they have a cup of coffee. So how does that work? Well, caffeine is a drug, right? It's like
it's a stimulant.
It's a drug. And so in some ways we've accepted that those things are helpful to us. Now imagine if there's another version of it that's actually just a way to enhance our creative circuitry. Maybe coffee one day won't just be to make us awake. Maybe it will be actually to make us slightly more in tune with our creativity. Some version of that. So I think there are simple ways and then also more sophisticated ways using magnetic disruption of neural circuitry, behavioral methods to facilitate specific neural circuits that in the end may all lead to a therapeutic version of creative neuroscience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know if people have come to me so much about writer's block. I mean, they more get my students coming to talk to me about stage fright, but I would say writer's block is in some ways related to that kind of stage fright. Is this feeling that whatever I produce isn't good enough, or I can't get anything down on paper, or I can't seem to write any music, or I can't seem to perform what I want. And I think, anecdotally, what we've always been told, if you have writer's block, sit down and just start writing, right? We know, I love reading about these stories about the great artists and creatives throughout history and what they did. And a lot of the great writers, scientists, writers, etc., what they would do is they just had a practice of writing. And I think that just sitting down and putting pen to paper and just starting to write, that is kind of kicking into that expertise we were talking about. That maybe it's not your best work, but you're starting the creative juices going in some ways because you're at least engaging in your art form. And even if you have to throw away a lot of what you write, or you have to, you give a bad performance, it's not necessarily bad per se. It's at least you still did something. And that's something we used a lot in music school too, conservatory. Like, yeah, of course you feel down when you gave a bad performance, you had a bad lesson, but the most important thing is, okay, you got to go up and do it again. And eventually you get a groove again. I think there's an ebb and flow to artistic production. So certainly when other of my students come in like, what do I do if I can't write a paper? I'm like, then you just sit down and write. Even if you have to throw away the 3 pages you wrote for me, just start writing. And we'll see what happens.
I've read, actually there's a great book, I can't remember what it's called. I think it's called like Daily Rituals.
Yes, I read that. I love
Yeah.
that book.
You have?
Yeah.
And they basically take like 400 of the greatest artists
Yeah.
throughout, composers, writers, actors, directors throughout history.
Scientists, yeah.
And find all the research they can about what their daily routine was. And what they really found out was like almost everyone had a routine, but like a lot of them used drugs. A lot of them used drugs. And I mean, it's like people looking for that inspiration.
Mm-hmm. And if they don't use drugs, they had something in their routine that got them out of their normal thing. So maybe it's they go for a walk every day, or they go take a swim every day, or they take a nap, or, you know, they have to, you know, they had other ways to like break up whatever monotony is going on in their brain, you know? So I thought that was really interesting. And the other thing that I noticed too about creative activity, something that was really striking to me is they're not working 9 to 5, not all of them. Like they don't go and sit down in a cubicle and do, you know, sometimes, you know, Emily Dickinson wrote very little in one day, and, or maybe it wasn't her, but some of them only write, you know, 30 minutes a day, or 2 hours a day, or 4 hours a day, or 6 hours a day, right? It was very variable. So I thought that was really fascinating too, because, you know, it's like, well, I guess, again, that shows the individual basis of creativity too. Not every artist works the same way. So maybe what we're finding in Colin is very specific to Colin too. You never know. We'll have to do more research.
Inspiration? What's, have you found any, have you found inspiration in there when you're looking in those brains?
Yeah, that's another very difficult topic to address with neuroscience. You know, people always talk about what are the muses and what does that really mean. I actually don't have a clear concept of what that means neurologically, but I think of it as a construct that people use to put themselves in a creative mode. I don't view it as something that's the same for everybody. I think that in the end, when somebody turns to some form of inspiration, what they're really doing is they're identifying that that one thing makes them want to be creative and feel comfortable with creativity, and before you know it, they've gotten over their block, if they have such a thing, and ideas are flowing. It's a way of, I think, optimizing their brains.
Okay. So one of the main thrusts of the movie is about conflict resolution. And we found that there are drama therapists
Mm-hmm.
that are, and applied improvisation psychologists who are using improv in sessions between people who are in a conflict.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that works in terms of being more creative? How can that help us solve conflict specifically?
You know, at a very pragmatic level, I think it's hard to say. There's several abstract and I think philosophical underpinnings to creativity that I think are very binding. I guess to me, studying creativity, what I've started to feel is that it's universal, right? And I think that no matter who you are, you can admire another person's creativity, no matter what culture they're from, no matter what historical period they're from. And so there's something about it that's, maybe it's because it's self-reflective, but you can understand when somebody else has a phenomenal creative achievement, that something wonderful took place. And it's binding. It's not a divisive thing. It's the opposite. It's binding. It draws you together. And I think I view that from humanity's perspective, maybe that is really what the arts have done, right? It's a way to communicate and to provide that glue that draws humans together, to allow them to understand that we're actually much more similar than we are different. And it's like, oh yeah, I knew I had some version of that experience, but you captured it or articulated it in the perfect way. It's a way that I never could have. And all of a sudden, I understand my own life better because you articulated it that way. To me, that is, maybe it's not the same as stopping a fight, but maybe it will prevent a fight from ever having started.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I don't know that I have an informed opinion as a scientist, but I mean, in my own opinion, I can see how creativity can help conflict resolution, because I think ultimately creativity, as Charles mentioned, it stems from experience and connections with people and empathy, and I think all of those aid in conflict resolution. Certainly comedy is wonderful at diffusing tension, right, if there is any conflict. And so I think if I had to give my own opinion about it, I think it's that creativity in all our forms in general is about this very human connection. Sometimes saying things or capturing things in a way that it so perfectly captures the situation that it helps people hit a better understanding, better empathy with one another. Again, I don't necessarily have scientific evidence to support that, but that's what my own intuition is telling me.
So the Kennedy Center and the National Institutes of Health have recently embarked on something called Sound Health, and it's a way to bring science and music together to improve human health. And the genesis of this project was interesting because Renee Fleming, the opera superstar, and Francis Collins, the director of the NIH, were at a party where Supreme Court justices were. And they had just emerged, I think, from a decision on same-sex marriage that was very tense. And the room was apparently quite tense at the party. And what did they do? Francis Collins and Renee decided to sing a song together. And that changed everything. It was the icebreaker that changed the party, but also it led them to realize that they ought to harness this, amazing healing property of song and to build it into something larger systematically through the NIH, through the Kennedy Center. And so it's something I've been working on with them for about 3 years now. And it's, I think, a really profound idea that something as simple as music can, maybe make us better human beings worldwide.
Maybe we can sort of just to recap and kind of sum up everything that you've learned from your research to this point.
That's it?
Yeah.
Oh, your entire career, Coach House.
Yeah, into just some kind of a prescription for moving forward as a society, if you can. Like, it doesn't have to be fully inclusive, but if you had to give your best advice to the world to move forward and not destroy itself and thrive over the next 100, 200 years, where do you think we need to go? What should we be focusing on? What should we be doing?
Wow,
I'll
tell you the way I feel about it personally, which is that the one lesson to me of medicine and science and maybe art is humility. Okay, it's that nothing is ever guaranteed in this life. Right? I mean, I see people whose lives were normal one day and the next day they're fatally ill, or they've received a diagnosis that will forever change their life. And so you can never take time for granted. You can never take people for granted. You can never take the future for granted. And because of that, I feel like, in a way, that is the great lesson of both sickness, but also wellness. I mean, and to me, the whole point of all of this is to live a better life. When I do this kind of science, it makes me, I feel fundamentally like arrogance has no part in it. Okay, because what you learn right away is that you know nothing. Okay? We know nothing about these things. We are just barely scratching the surface. And that will probably be true for many, many, many hundreds of years, that we're always going to feel like we're barely scratching the surface. And when I'm confronted by that degree of humility, that I see it so clearly in front of me how little we know, it's very hard then to do the opposite, which is to be arrogant about knowledge or to dismiss other people's experiences or knowledge. It does the opposite. It makes you realize that all of us in this planet know very little, and none of us should take any of it for granted, because we're all fundamentally trying to do the same thing. We're all trying to live better lives on this planet that we share with each other. And so to me, I think I try to live a better life and be a better human because I see these things in front of me all the time. Do I always succeed? No, but I am at least aware that I'm failing when I fail.
Yeah, I mean, I think something that I love working about Charles is he is someone who really values the beauty in life, because he's also, as a surgeon, confronted when someone's family or your own life gets blown up by bad health or something happening. And I think something that both Charles and I love about studying the arts is we study beauty, right? Like why do we do all this research? Is that we think studying the arts and creativity, which makes the world more beautiful, is a really noble goal. I mean, a society that was only just always about survival, like, Maslow's hierarchy needs, if you're just on, food, water, it's not a very fun existence. And I think we find it just very inspiring ourselves to get to study the arts, to be around people who do these amazing, talented things. And I mean, we're also, both artists ourselves, and we just do believe in arts wholeheartedly. Like, we do think creativity is such one of the key, vital, important things that we all need to continue to hold on to, and because it brings joy to us and it brings joy and beauty into the world. So I guess that just kind of piggybacks on what Charles says, but that's certainly why I like doing it every day.
Well, that's great. Well, I want to give you a chance now, and then we'll play some music. Just anything else that you think we should know about the work that you've been doing that maybe I haven't touched on, things that you thought about before?
I have something that I think, this is maybe not quite what you want, but I'll tell you it's important. So I don't think that people understand that it's not as if there's a big scientific funding agency that wants to look at the science of the arts, okay? These studies are hard to do, they're hard to fund, yet they're very important. I think that people that love music, love the arts, have loved comedy throughout their lives, maybe don't realize that if you wanted to understand those art forms from a scientific perspective, it takes resources. And so we need help, okay, is the bottom line. We need help from many different perspectives. We need artists that want to participate in this kind of work. So if you are, a certain kind of artist and you think that you want to participate in this kind of thing, you should let us know, because we're actively trying to contact artists to invite them, and we only have a limited pool of resources. And that's the other thing. If you want to support this kind of work, we need help in that aspect too, because every time we do one of these brain scans, it's thousands of dollars to run these experiments. It's not free. And so if one day we have the world's artistic geniuses that want to participate, but we can't actually afford it, we don't have the resources, it would be such a lost opportunity. And so we really need help. I think that people often think that we're, this work, because we're working with some of the best artists, that there must be a large body of resources devoted to it, but actually we're always on the verge of shutting down.
Yeah.
And so I want to make sure that people understand that. Like, we're struggling to survive to get this stuff done, and we need help.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, we are so grateful to the National Endowment for the Arts this was the first time they had a funding mechanism for something that would study creativity and cognition. So that's amazing, but it's very new. And this is probably, Charles and our biggest challenge, in addition to coming up with cool experiments, is we're constantly worried about the money. Like, how are we going to fund this? And he's right, it's $600 an hour to run the fMRI machine, and it's very expensive to run these. And when you're constantly worried about money, it is hard to be creative about the science as well. So funding, I think we need buy-in from funding agencies that show that the arts and creativity are important, and that use funding to show that we value these things in our society. And then, of course, we need artists to buy into this as well. And something that we're very lucky that Colin came is he's showing us that he supports scientific research. And so that was amazing. We do need artists to believe in it. So I completely agree with Charles. Yeah, we're always scrambling to look for the next way of funding our studies.
Yeah, I'm in that club too.
I feel like all artists are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. great, you guys.
I love it. It was so much fun. I like playing with you, Charles.
Here's your self-study. Take a journey of exploration around your space now, wherever you are. Imagine you're just about a year old and starting to walk. Walk or even crawl around your space for about 5 minutes, exploring, using that sense of wonder that a newborn would have. If you're thinking in your head in sentences or words, you're doing the exercise wrong. Explore the space as if you had no vocabulary at all, no concepts to explain anything you see. Come back here and journal your experience of your newborn exploration. What was it like to have that lack of conscious self-monitoring?